During the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese Forces and the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a series of attacks around the fractured country designed to cripple the South Vietnamese and their American allies. Part of the plan involved the capture of a number of cities, such as the city of Hue, with the goal of rooting out much of the South Vietnamese civilian leadership. Civil servants, priests, and foreign teachers were rounded up and detained. Once the city of Hue had been recaptured, some 2,800 bodies were found of those who had been abducted, many found bound at their hands with their heads smashed open. In today's video, we will cover the massacre that took place at the city of Hue, why such a massacre took place, and what it meant for the war at large. It is perhaps helpful to start with a brief explanation of the war before the Tet Offensive. In very simple terms, the Communist North fought a guerrilla war against the American-backed South Vietnam. Before 1968, the Viet Cong operated via guerrilla tactics, striking from the shadows and from villages in the Vietnamese jungle. It was difficult for the South Vietnamese and their American allies to fully gauge the size of the Viet Cong, and it was perhaps naively believed that the Viet Cong was all but defeated. This would prove to be a grave miscalculation, as demonstrated in the Tet Offensive. Surprise attacks took place on the Vietnamese Lunar New Year festival, taking everyone by surprise as there had been an arranged truce for the festival's duration. No attack was expected on such an important holiday, meaning some cities, including Hue, had a lower number of active soldiers stationed within. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops numbering approximately 80,000 struck all over the country, targeting many military sites and attacking civilians in positions of power. In Hue, the Communist Forces' key targets were the Tay Loc airfields and the Massacre garrison, a small fortress in the old imperial city district of Hue. The attack began in the early morning of the 31st of January 1968. Key gates to the city were breached. Rockets and mortars were fired as the attack began in earnest. Although there are reports of defenses mounted by the South Vietnamese, by mid-morning, the airfield was captured by the Communist Forces. The Massacre garrison, however, stood fast against the North Vietnamese, who instead went on the defensive. This, however, would allow for American and South Vietnamese reinforcements, who would prove to be vital to retaking the city of Hue. The Battle of Hue lasted until the 24th of February 1968, and would be the largest urban engagement in the Vietnam War. But during the occupation, the North Vietnamese forces were able to carry out a number of abductions, tortures, and massacres of those deemed to have no future in the North Vietnamese world. The Communist forces established their rule within Hue. Within the liberated zones, as named by the North Vietnamese, indoctrination centers were run. Food was also rationed, and youths were used for manual labor and combat. But a major drive for the Communist forces was to identify and eliminate the reactionary forces that would look to oppose their rule. Those who were deemed capable of accepting the communist way of thinking were sent for re-education, with the view to re-employ them at a later date. For those low-level bureaucrats who had taken up arms against the North Vietnamese too were sent for re-education, though there would be no role for them within the government even following completion of the program. But for those seen to be the cruel tyrants and reactionary elements, there was to be no recourse or fixing of their mindsets. Lists were drawn up by the Viet Cong and distributed to the Communist forces. Targets to be rounded up as soon as possible. Those who ended up on the lists included South Vietnamese soldiers, high-ranking civil servants, political party members, religious leaders, American teachers, and other foreigners. Many of these were identified and singled out with help from the South Vietnamese communists and revolutionaries who had fought against the South Vietnamese government. Many being Hue residents able to return and play an instrumental role in rounding up the enemy. At the very top of the list for those to be executed were members of the South Vietnamese secret police. Catholic priests, too, were a key target, but the initial focus was to round up high-ranking civilian and military leadership and move them elsewhere for further interrogation. The goal was to establish a new social order that would be conducive for a communist state. It was deemed that the Catholic leaders, business owners, and others regarded as servants for American imperialism would have no place in the desired society. Many were subject to summary judgment by show trial, which would decide guilt after only a few minutes. Those found guilty would be sentenced to death for the nebulous offense of crimes against the people. There was, however, a change in approach to the undesirable elements, when it became clear that efforts to retake the city would be successful. Instead, the focus appeared to shift to the execution, not just the re-education of the reactionary elements. It would seem that the North Vietnamese forces wanted to leave no witnesses to their efforts to pacify Hue. Targets then shifted to those able to identify witnesses who would be able to point out who was responsible. It was only when the city was retaken on the 26th of February by the South Vietnamese and their American backers that evidence came to light of the massacres. By this point, much of Hue had been leveled. Around 8,000 civilians were uncalled for, and 80% of the city was damaged, with over 150,000 people left homeless. It was not until June of 1968 that some 18 mass graves were uncovered, with around 1,200 bodies. At least half of the bodies unearthed in Hue showed clear signs of murder. Many bodies were exhumed with hands tied behind their backs, with cloth stuffed into their mouths, and perhaps most horrific of all, evidence of bodies twisted in ways that indicated that they were buried alive. Many of the corpses appeared to have been executed in the same manner, with blunt force trauma to the head. It would take a few months more, but evidence of deliberate acts of murder committed by the communist forces was discovered. Reports and instructions appear to show that some 2,700 people had been declared as eliminated during the occupation of Hue. Further graves continue to be found, with hundreds more bodies dug up. Some eyewitness accounts described many individuals being led away by the Viet Cong forces, only to be found dead and buried with dozens more. German doctors Raymond Discher, Alois Alterkircher, and Hurst Günther Kranig were found dumped in a shallow grave in a nearby field. They had all taught at a local medical school and believed themselves to be safe from any harm. A Vietnamese priest named Bu Dong, who had provided his services to both sides of the conflict and hung a photograph of Ho Chi Minh in his room, was seen being detained and dragged away by the Viet Cong. His corpse was exhumed in a shallow grave along with the bodies of 300 others. The massacre at Hue was soon used as proof of the communists' desires as to the whole of Vietnam. Following the unification of Vietnam under the North Vietnamese Communist Forces, no such mass executions of the South Vietnamese or those who collaborated with American forces took place. Instead, hundreds of thousands were sent to re-education camps. In these camps, they would be subject to torture, starvation, and horrific conditions. This response confounded many in the international community, who expected such reprisals, pointing to Hue as an example of what would happen should the North be victorious. Explanations as to just what happened at Hue are not just limited to orders from the top. A book called A Viet Cong Memoir, written by Trong Nhu Tang, offers another explanation. Tang was a leading anti-South Vietnamese politician with ties to the Viet Cong, and his book details how he had spoken to some of his Viet Cong comrades, who, whilst admitting that civilians were massacred, insisted that those who committed the murders were young, fanatical, and ill-disciplined soldiers. They were aided by other Hue civilians who took matters into their own hands. It was put forward that some of those who died were not killed by the orders of the higher-ups, but rather a spontaneous tragedy, all too commonly seen in war. There are also controversies as to the numbers killed and as to the cause of death. Access to the mass graves was limited to only a select few in the media, and those who did not attend noted discrepancies. Some have even suggested that some of the dead were killed during the effort to take Hue, and were buried alongside those massacred by the North, thus inflating the figures. There is, however, little doubt that the North Vietnamese forces did engage in the murder of those deemed reactionary, though there does appear to have been an effort for re-education, otherwise known as an attempt to coerce a new set of more agreeable beliefs. It would seem like this was the original aim of the Viet Cong. However, this soon developed into a situation where thousands were killed. Many historians have noted it is difficult to know for certain just how many were massacred, but very few doubt that such massacres took place. It is important to also note that many civilians would have been killed during the attempts to retake the city. According to Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci, altogether there have been 1,100 killed after liberation by South Vietnamese forces, notably students, university teachers, and priests. Intellectuals and religious people at Hue have never hidden their sympathy for the NLF. Then there are the 1,000 or so civilians who died during the attempt to retake the city, caught up in the fierce urban warfare. It is difficult to separate propaganda from truth. To this day, it is still difficult for those who lost family to the massacre in Hue to recognize their loss. Those responsible for the massacre were never punished. Nor is it even part of the story of the Vietnamese account of the war. It is simply ignored and glossed over. Yet there does exist a series of accounts from one witness to the massacre. A book called Mourning Headband for Hue offers the first-hand account. It details not only the massacre but also the experience of war by the Vietnamese civilians caught up in the mayhem. The human experience of the Vietnam War is often easily forgotten, especially true for the countless anonymous Vietnamese. For those who wish to read further about this event, it is certainly a great place to start. The massacre at Hue City was undoubtedly a politically charged event, both by anti-communist forces seeking to show the fate that would befall Vietnam should the North succeed, and by the post-war government seeking to hide the truth behind the murders. Even conservative estimates as to the death toll linger around 2,000. The Vietnam War was without a doubt a bloody conflict, a civil war and a proxy war that ravaged neighboring countries and claimed the lives of millions. Within the context of such a massive loss of life, a few thousand does not seem like such a large number, though it is vital not to forget the individual human element, especially in war where dehumanization was par for the course. What is interesting about the massacre at Hue is the lack of any real reconciliation. A sense of history is an important factor in a person's and a nation's identity. To reject it is only ever damaging.